Good morning, Padres, and happy January to you all.
We have a great show planned for you today, starting with a segment covering senior driving habits, followed by Chris with the sports update.
After that, we'll check up on student slang at CHS and head out to say happy birthday to our fellow Padres with some of our teachers.
Welcome to the Friday show, Padres.
We'll be right back. Friday show.
Carmel High School's Winter Wonderland will be on February 3rd, hosted at the Monterey Fairgrounds, and you are cordially invited, if you buy a ticket for $20, that is.
Attire is semi-formal and you are welcome no matter what grade you're in.
Have you got your yearbook yet? Well, the deadline for pre-orders is January 31st. You can go to the ASB office or web store to purchase your yearbook for $80.
If you attended the senior meeting, then you may remember that there will be a senior video played at the senior breakfast. Please send in all your photos from elementary school through senior year ASAP if you want them in the video.
The deadline to order your panoramic photo is also on January 31st.
If you qualify for CSF because of your fall semester grades, you will be notified by your English teacher. Don't forget to fill out the application. If you're interested in active membership, come stop by every other Monday at lunch in room 22.
If you are a sophomore or a junior interested in becoming a doctor one day, there is an amazing opportunity to gain hands-on experience in the operating room and even observe real-life autopsies. The Future Docs Abroad will pay your entire tuition for one lucky future doctor.
Stop by Mrs. Hunt to get more information on this once-in-a-lifetime chance. And for all the seniors watching right now, new scholarships are popping up from the Monterey Peninsula Audubon Society and the Keenan Tyler Football Scholarship. Head over to Moodle if you would like to apply. Hey Aaron, do you have a car?
I do.
Do you park in the senior parking lot?
I do.
Do you see their reckless driving?
I do.
Me too. Here's a segment on that right now.
So Trey, are you a safe driver?
I'm the safest driver on campus.
Okay. Have you actually been in any accidents?
Nope.
No accidents, all right. Do your friends feel safe when they get in your car?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Have you actually been in any accidents?
7.
So how did those accidents actually happen?
Well, I crashed my first time driving into a tree.
I was pulling into a parking spot way too tight and I just hit another car. The lady was in the car, so it was a little bit awkward.
Have you actually ever been in an accident before?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay. So we're out here in the parking lot just looking for drivers. I've spotted a few, gotten a few so far, but looking for some more. Hey guys, how's it going? Do you guys consider yourselves safe drivers?
At all times, I'm always safe.
Always driving safe, looking both ways, making sure I don't hit anyone.
Awesome, awesome. So we're out here. Do you consider yourself a safe driver?
To be completely honest, no.
How many accidents have you been in?
0.
That's actually pretty safe. Do your friends feel safe when they get in your car?
Yes.
Oh, that's awesome. That sounds like a safe driver. I think you might be a safe driver.
I would hope my friends feel safe in my car. Boys Lacrosse is looking for a team manager. Get service hours by helping out the Lax Bros.
Speaking of sports, let's head over to Chris with the Padres Sports Update.
I'm your local Carmel High School sports analyst, Chris Catini, and we're going to be talking about the sports today and next week. We got freshman boys facing off against SoCal in basketball, and next week we got Monday, Wednesday, Friday full of sports. Girls and boys soccer, boys and girls basketball. Wednesday, same thing, boys and girls basketball and soccer. If you can make any of them, we'll appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris, and don't forget to head out to support your fellow Padres next week.
Clubs today: Ethic Bowl in room 25,
Red Cross in room 37,
K-pop in room 3,
Frisbee on the football field,
Investment Club in room 27,
Diversity in room 9,
Robotics in room 40,
and Legacy in room 46.
Club News: make sure you submit your winter formal royalty today, and if so, you can begin promoting your candidates today.
This Friday at lunch, there will be an informational meeting for Ethics Bowl. Those interested in competitive philosophy, this is for you.
From one squad to another, here's a lit segment on slang.
What's up, Padres? Logan here. Today we're going to be exploring CHS slang. Here with Max House. Any slang?
We got one word for you, Padres. Heinous. Wow, I got ruined by that test. That was heinous. That giant push in Clash Royale was so heinous.
Here with Chippy M. Tucker. Any slang for us, Chippy?
Rip or reap.
Sentence?
Rip Sub Allen, so rest in peace.
Yes, so I would like to explain the word send. Let's send it, boys. Send it for the boys.
Send it, Enrique.
Hello. Some lit. I'm Pickle Rick!
Is the word potent. It just means like, like a potent smell. It's like really bad.
Thank you.
Yep.
Well, it looks like they really sent it. The Pebble Beach Half Marathon is tomorrow. Sign up to volunteer. Info in the bulletin.
The 8th annual Whale Fest Monterey is this weekend and also needs help. It's at Fisherman's Wharf on Saturday and Sunday. Volunteers get 2.5 hours of service hours, a t-shirt, and a bowl of clam chowder.
Happy birthday to Carson Compinger, Aaron Joris, Juliana Pape, and Bryn Womble. Now over to some of our beloved teachers with the weekend birthdays.
Hey, and on Saturday, happy birthday to Thomas Fontenay and Anai Paz. Happy birthday, you two.
All right, and on Sunday, a happy birthday to Brian Cardenas, Cassidy Fasulo, Trevor Lynn, and Jordan McDougall.
Thanks, guys, and happy birthday, Padres.
Well, this is it.
See you later, Padres.
See ya.
Hello, my name is Pascal Montgomery, and I'm co-president of the Environmental Club here at CHS. So this is our first ever Earth Experts. It's broadcast on TV, which is cool. And here's our guest speaker, Dr. Elliott from UC Santa Cruz, and he works at NOAA. So we're going to start off with a question, then have people from the audience answer. Have another question, so yeah. So what's your major? What do you do as a scientist?
So I majored in zoology for my PhD, and I would broadly call myself a marine biologist. Specifically, I'm a quantitative ecologist, which basically is just a complicated way of saying I use math and computer programming to understand how animals move and how they respond to the ocean environment.
Cool. So have you done any recent field research in the past few years?
So last year was my first year not going into the field for work, which was a little bit sad. But in the past, I've been to all 7 continents. Probably most excitingly did a 3-week stint in Antarctica, doing putting tags on whales and trying to then measure the prey, see what they eat, how much, and when.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's cool. So in the recent years, have you noticed any opposition with climate change, and how do you approach people who ask you or your colleagues about how what you study is being altered or changed, impacted by climate change?
So one of the important things that I tend to do, because a lot of my research does butt up to climate change, I will very rarely talk about climate change without talking about climate variability as well, because it's one of the things that's really important to separate. And the reason I say that is, we have seasons, we have, a particularly warm winter, particularly cold winter, and it's a lot of folks want to either attribute that to climate change or use that as an excuse to deny climate change. But you have to really understand how that variability occurs naturally, and then being able to pull out where the climate change aspect is actually making those events either more extreme or in some cases more frequent too. So a lot of it is in just public outreach, making sure that people understand the difference between those two.
Yeah, definitely. So now we can start with people from the audience. Do you have any questions that you would like to ask?
What's your favorite animal that you've studied? What's your favorite animal that you've studied?
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a tough one. I go 2 different ways. One is bluefin tuna, and I love bluefin tuna because just if you think of them as a machine or as just, their physiology is so unique, is so extreme to be able to swim so fast and migrate ocean basins and also serve kind of as this, really iconic top predator, particularly here, in the Monterey Bay Aquarium as well. I also, though, really like studying small schooling animals. because those tend to be the kind of the base of the food web that brings these really interesting top predators to our area. So things like krill, anchovies, and sardine, figuring out where they occur and why is one of my primary research questions too.
Anyone else have a question? Yes.
What do you think the most pressing concern in our oceans right now is?
Great question. The most pressing concern in the oceans is really it is in many ways twofold. I think broadly one of our issues, and as a scientist I am guilty of this as well, is we tend to be very reactive rather than proactive. And I think that's more from that's more my answer from a management perspective, but a lot of times we don't have the funding nor the time on the job to be able to set in place things that will allow us to tackle a problem before it becomes huge. Instead, we're often jumping to the next fire to put it out whenever that does happen. I think more specifically, my main drive of doing what I do is that I want there to be fish in the ocean for my children, my grandchildren, to not just enjoy and see, but to eat too, because it is such an important food resource. And I think that's going to be a difficult one to maintain with changing species distribution due to climate change, increased populations, and just changing dynamics in the future. So that's one of the things that I personally feel is really important. But the difficult thing is it depends a lot of where you are, because if you live in a small island in the Maldives, if anyone knows where that is in the middle of the Indian Ocean, your primary concern is going to be sea level rise, because your islands are going to be underwater soon. So it's one of these things where there's not a one size fits all solution, but it really does kind of require a big picture view to try to tackle hopefully all the things at once.
Hi, Elliot. My name's Jason Mossbald, and I'm a teacher here at Carmel High School. And I'm always interested in just kind of hearing people's stories about how they got to where they are, like everything from how long have you known that you wanted to, and the basis for this question is I have a lot of kids, I have a lot of students tell me that, they want to be a marine biologist when they grow up. And I'm just curious what your story is in terms of like when you knew that you wanted to be a marine biologist, and then also what were the some of the challenges of the pathway to get there, and like what would students expect on the pathway to becoming a marine biologist. Yep. And then also at the point that you now are finally a marine biologist, what are the realities of the job? So sorry, that's a
three-parter. Yeah, you might have to remind me, but yeah. No, those are all good questions. There were really two kind of tipping points that put me towards the career that I'm at. I actually went to college my first 2 years being pre-law. I was going to be a lawyer, go into law, and switched over, also kind of experimented with pre-med, trying to be a doctor. And I took organic chemistry, 250 people, and just was not scared, but just hated the competitiveness of it all. And so I ended up trying to kind of look for other careers, ended up going to the Duke Marine Lab in Beaufort, North Carolina, got to spend basically every weekend out on a boat. And I learned that being on the water had just kind of a sublime influence on me, that I just felt more at ease than I did in many other places. The other thing is, through that, I reached out and tried to do basically what's called a REU, or Research Experience for Undergraduate, and that program was critical because it put me in touch with a preeminent scientist, and I ended up spending the summer dissecting Atlantic croaker stomachs in a basement with no windows, full of fumes of ethanol and formaldehyde, and I loved it. So I would say the fact, if you can put yourself in a situation doing some of the worst aspects of marine science and you still love it, it's a good sign you're interested or willing to go into marine biology. In terms of hurdles, I think the biggest one now is that there aren't nearly as many jobs there are a lot more people being produced doing marine science, I feel like, than the jobs. Like if I look back to my supervisor 15 years ago, he was able to get a job pretty quickly right after school. When I was applying for jobs, I had to do about 1 or 2 years of postdoc work, which is kind of like a glorified internship after you get your PhD. Nowadays, I know people that are doing 5, 6, 7 years of that. And so it's a little scary that there is this kind of crunch, kind of at the extreme end. The advantage, or kind of one of the unexpected advantages, is that there are a number of other jobs that aren't your typical path. So I have one friend from grad school that's now doing basically statistics for college admissions, trying to figure out to colleges, how do you find a student that's most likely to graduate and make sure that when you accept a student, they are on the path for success. So you can take what you learn in a PhD. It may not be the marine biology, or in his case, the evolutionary biology that he was trained in, but you learn a lot of those same deductive reasoning techniques that you can then apply to kind of a novel space. So that's one of the aspects. I think those were the first two. The third question as to the reality now, one of the big ones is the decline in field work. So my peak, I spent 3.5 months at sea, I think in 2009, where I went to Antarctica, went to the Bahamas, went to Gulf of Maine, all on boats collecting data, doing really fun field research. But over time, I find myself doing less and less of the science and more of managing people. And it's one of those things you would never expect because I wasn't trained to manage people. But as you progress just career-wise, you end up instead, now I'm more likely trying to find money to pay people than necessarily doing the quantitative science that I might want to do. So that's I think kind of the trickiest thing that I would never have expected. And there's benefits and drawbacks to that, because I get to teach people, older people than you guys, but get to teach people nonetheless, which is really fun. But I don't get to do as much of the hands-on science that I did earlier on in my career.
You were talking about tagging whales in Antarctica, and I was wondering what other sorts of field studies you've done to measure the distributions and populations of species and the changes in those.
Yeah, so in terms of the field work, most of the field work I have done has been either on NOAA vessels, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that I work for, those vessels where we do surveys and literally use what are called big eyes, giant binoculars, to count the number of marine mammals that are out there, and then measure the water column properties that underlie those distributions, or this kind of this tagging project. So the tagging projects to me are really interesting because they let the animals tell you where they go, whereas on a survey you're doing a very systematic. It's much easier statistically to deal with the data because it's very cleanly collected, but you might survey an area where you find no animals. And there have been examples of that on the East Coast, actually, likely due to climate change, where we've had colleagues going out trying to find North Atlantic right whales. And all of them right now, they normally feed in the Gulf of Maine into the Bay of Fundy, and they're all further north in Canada. And so you have a survey go out, try to look for these animals, and they're not there. What do you do? But that's where the tags can tell you something about where the animals actually went, and hopefully some of their decision making as to why they went there.
You mentioned using computer science in your day-to-day work. How far removed are you from the code, like on a daily basis? Do you find yourself having to write a lot of programs, or do you use pre-existing algorithms and things?
Yeah, the cool thing is a bit of both. I mean, I'd say maybe 30% of my time now is coding, whereas again, right in the earlier part of my career, I spent about 90% of my time really coding. And it's all using R Studio, open source software. I actually next week get to go to San Diego for training, so I'm going to completely geek out with a bunch of R nerds. And that aspect, especially when you're dealing with difficult data like tag data, it's really useful to be able to have more complex statistical techniques that kind of requires that programming aspect. The cool thing is we have one person in our lab that's really forced us to use this thing called, you guys might already know about this, but GitHub, which is an online repository that allows essentially sharing of code and comment editing. And that was something like growing up I would have killed for, because a lot of times you'll start down a path and say, oh, somebody else has already done that. And so then you can basically just fork their code, download it on your computer, and build upon it however you need. So those sort of aspects have made the programming aspect of the job a lot more, a lot easier, I'd say, or at least a lot less time consuming.
Have you done a lot of collaboration with the Monterey Bay Aquarium?
Yes, so the main project, I work really closely with the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, as well as the science team there. So this is folks like Kyle Van Houten, Sal Jorgensen, who leads the White Shark program, Andre Bustani's tunas, I'm trying to think some of the others, there are a few others that I work with there. But a lot of those folks are also very interested in animal tagging and where these things go, and conservation. And so that's one of the nice things is, NOAA, we're more responsible for the science to inform management, But if we can partner with people that are doing the conservation, those data can go kind of twice as far. And in terms of one of the cool projects we had it was joint between the aquarium and Ambari, is we had a project, it was actually a National Geographic grant to tag jellyfish. So it's trying to figure out how you attach a tag onto the back of a jellyfish and measure, jellyfish movement, to see how active are they swimming against the current versus just being passively drifted.
How'd that pan out?
So the cool aspect is we got it really successfully in the tanks, and we were able to have the tag stay on for about 3 weeks, largely thanks to a donation from a medical supply company. Basically, they gave us this glue that is used to suture up wounds after surgery that worked really well on attaching tags to jellyfish. But the sad part was our postdoctoral scholar who was with us left, or the year she was here, there were no jellyfish in the bay. And so she actually now is accepted a job working on, I think, flatback turtles in Western Australia, and this year jellyfish were everywhere. So if we had had this jellyfish bloom that we had this year about 2 or 3 years ago, we could have had a lot more tags out on the field. So that's something we're still hoping to do, but we haven't been able to really get out on the water and test it out yet.
So you were talking about your work and programming and, staying at your lab and sort of trying to model the data, and then, like you were saying with the jellyfish, going out and actually trying to do whatever you're trying to accomplish, and it doesn't exactly work out as planned. How often does that sort of happen, and the difference between staying in the lab and programming versus going out in the field and seeing the results make sense?
Yeah, that's another very good question. There ends up being a pretty big dichotomy in the field, in that there are a lot of people, even within NOAA, that end up spending 5 months out of the year at sea, or doing a lot of time. And the problem with that is often their data ends up on somebody's computer, and then they don't have the time to analyze it. And so the first time, especially the first time you collect any sort of data, there are often problems, difficulties, lessons to be learned. The nice thing, for example, the whale tagging work we've been doing, and I'm peripheral to the tagging aspect, but we've been doing that since I think 2003 and 4. And actually, I can go back even further than that. But the advantage is, back then, if you got one tag on a whale in a week, that was a success. Now, I think just last year they got 11 tags on whales in a single day. So with being able to practice and getting new tools, new technologies, you can really kind of hone that down. But then new problems come up and new tools. So it's definitely an iterative process. And the biggest thing I would say is it's important to have those people that are really good at collecting the data in the field, and those people that are really good at analyzing them. Ideally, everybody would be both, but just in reality, that's not always the way it works. So making sure those folks work together is the best way to get the data analyzed and get it out where it needs to be.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
So recently we watched the movie Chasing Coral, and it was really, really saddening, but also it really opened your eyes a lot about what's happening. And they mentioned that even if we stopped pollution, like all pollution right now, it would take years, or maybe nothing would heal at all. So my question is, do you think it's too late for a lot of stuff like that? And if not, what can we do to help?
Yeah, I think we often end up sending out, and particularly just kind of the way science is framed, we end up sending out doom and gloom stories. And I mean, I can speak to some, from fisheries, for example, that haven't really hit the news, is that, most of the folks in the room probably are not aware that a lot of overfished species here on the West Coast recently have been delisted. So they've been now termed into healthy fishing levels over just the past 2 or 3 years, which is something that, was expected to take 50 to 75 years and ended up being rebuilt, as the term, in about, 20. So a lot of the successes don't always get as clearly spread as the doom and gloom. With the example of corals, I know there's a researcher at Hopkins Marine Station here in Pacific Grove that's looking at specific populations of corals that live in really high temperature, highly anthropogenically impacted environments, and looking at the genetics to see what makes them succeed. Why do they survive? So I think the world has been around for a long time. It is a very buffered system, and the key thing is figuring out where you can find those one of the terms I've heard, hope spots, basically areas where we're not hurting the world as fast as other places, and figure out what's working there, and then applying those solutions to some of the kind of more damaged areas. Is what I'd say. So I think there are a lot of things to be worried about, but I still would say that, I mean, especially if you think about how much we've come as humanity with regards to technology, I think a lot of the problems we will be able to engineer ourselves out of, it'll just be 10 to 20 to 100 times more costly than if we had addressed them from the get-go. Okay. Yeah, frankly.
Thank you.
Hopefully that helps.
What do you think could be a good solution, or perhaps a start to a solution to resolving some of the problems like climate change or pollution? What do you personally believe would be effective?
Yeah, the biggest problem, and it's very familiar working in the federal government, is that so many of the issues like climate change, science doesn't really matter. It's almost all politics. And so what I would say is I think it's really important to have scientists that are well-versed in public outreach and are able to talk to journalists and make sure that the issue is being framed in the correct way. And by framed, I'm not saying make things up, but really make sure that again, the good sides, the bad sides, what can be done, I think is a really critical one. The other is that I would say I'd love to see more of is I'd love to see more science literate people in politics directly too. So electing people that have maybe master's degrees, if not PhDs in science, that can actually speak to these issues in a way that are not, again, are not solely political. Those would be two of my goals. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
By having these like scientifically literate people in politics, you think you could help spread awareness of more of these hope spots and kind of counteract the thought that a lot of people have that the climate change can't be reversed, and the sort of things that she was saying, in which a lot of people are having more of a pessimistic view and kind of giving an accurate view. Do you think that will help?
I do. I mean, I think science literacy is, I mean, and it's not just getting it in the highest levels of government, but also, I mean, even just nationally, I think we as a country, there are still people that say, oh, well, something is just a hypothesis. It's not a fact, it's just a hypothesis. But understanding the importance of a hypothesis in the scientific process, that wouldn't be an insult the way that it is to people that don't understand that aspect. So I think science literacy more broadly is important. The politicians, having science literate politicians themselves won't be enough, is I guess what I'm kind of saying. But I do think that having that level, the hope is that some of the important science that is being done will at least make its way more directly into political action than I think often currently kind of happens, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So the technology that you're using to track animals, is NOAA the one who's creating it, or is it another company that you're buying from? And how often do new innovative products come out?
Yeah, so the marine tracking kind of community, there's a meeting every year called biologging, which is basically where you have the scientists and the companies creating the tools get together and kind of talk about what's needed, what kind of the future is, moving forward. And there's one main company really that produces a lot of the tags that folks use. All that said, there was a PhD student that, either didn't like the academic experience, couldn't find a job, whatever the decision, decided that his time would be best spent going into tag production. And so they have a company now out of...
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Elliott, and thank you for asking your questions. This has been a really good session. Thank you. And this closes the environmental experts. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Good questions, all about it.